Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Mariners Museum. Our speakers here tonight come to us with really fascinating stories about the way the water binds us all together. Doctors James Kendra and Tricia Wachtendorf have different backgrounds, but they've joined together on a really important collaboration. Tricia Wachtendorf is a sociologist by training. She earned her PhD from the University of Delaware in 2004, where she now serves as a professor of sociology. She's participated in quick response field work after events such as the 2001 World Trade Center attacks, the tsunamis affecting India and Sri Lanka and Japan, hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, as well as earthquakes in China and Haiti. Among many other things, she studies how people improvise in disaster situations, how people find housing after emergencies, the logistics of disaster response. James Kendra's training is in maritime transportation and geography and emergency management. He earned a doctorate in geography from Rutgers and now serves on the faculty of public policy and administration at Delaware. He's a master mariner. He studies both individual and organizational responses to risk and creativity during crises. He was present during the responses to 9/11 and the Indian Ocean tsunami, and he's previously served as the coordinator of Emergency Administration and Planning Program at the University of North Texas. Together, Drs. Wachtendorf and Kendra direct the Disaster Research Center at the University of Delaware. It's an organization dedicated to advancing the state-of-the-art in disaster research and scientifically guided practice. Please give a warm welcome to James Kendra and Tricia.
Good evening. On September 11th, 2001, like most people around the country and like many people around the world, our eyes were focused on the television, on the terrorist attacks, and as well the subsequent collapse of the Twin Towers in New York. But as researchers at the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center, the world's oldest center focused on the social science and management aspects of disasters, we were also focused on what we could learn. We went up to New York City 2 days after the attacks and spent much of the next 2 months observing response activities. We returned a year later to learn even more. But what we came to know through that initial field work was that while we were looking at the burning towers, while we were focused on what was happening down at ground zero, something remarkable was happening along the water's edge. So imagine 500,000 people evacuated by boat, by dinner cruise vessels, an ad hoc flotilla of ferries and tugboats, all in a single day. Imagine that flotilla evolving to bring personnel and supplies to Manhattan on return trips to get more people. That's impressive enough. Now imagine that none of that was planned for, that it was improvised in the midst of crisis by people saying that they just did what they had to do. That's extraordinary. And that's exactly what happened.
Many of us can look back on that spectacularly clear day. That was what so many people reflected back on when talking about those events, the cloudless sky and the perfect weather. And nobody knew what was going to be unfolding in Manhattan over the course of that morning, or that just a few hours later, those clear skies would be anything but clear.
It looked like you had landed on the moon, one person we spoke with reflected on as he thought what the aftermath looked like. Everything was quiet. The boats were covered in their gray dust. It looked like something out of a haunted movie.
The Boatlift began before the collapse of the Twin Towers. Some ferry captains arriving in Manhattan turned around rather than disembark their passengers, while others picked up passengers who had fled down to the waterfront very early during the emergency. And as events developed, people evacuating from the World Trade Center fled in all directions. Some of them marched uptown, others traveled east across the Brooklyn Bridge, and many of us can remember the photographs of these long lines of people walking across Manhattan over the bridge and to safety. Others, though, whose path of escape sent them to the south and to the west of the World Trade Center, soon found that they were brought up short at the waterfront, and there people began to congregate at various areas around the lower part of Manhattan. Many of these evacuees were Manhattan commuters who were looking for an opportunity to get home, while others were residents or employees of the lower Manhattan area who were looking for a way to escape the very hazardous conditions that had suddenly developed in that part of the city. And in response to this emerging need for transportation, boats of every description converged on Manhattan. Some of them acted independently. Others sought permission from the Coast Guard, who first initially told them just to stand by, and then later directed them to position themselves in readiness before the Coast Guard issued its historic call for all available boats to participate in the evacuation. Essentially, as evacuees lined up ashore, boats stood offshore, they negotiated with each other for whatever dock space was available. Sometimes they tied up to trees or lampposts or to each other, and they embarked passengers. Over about the next 10 hours, these boats made repeated trips all around New York Harbor. In total, about 100 to 120 boats succeeded in evacuating several 100,000 people from Manhattan.
So what led people to improvise the way that they did? Well, identity was certainly key. Take, for example, boat captain Pamela Hepburn. She found her way to the evacuation saying, "The only thing I can do is the boat thing. I can't do anything else." So I think we can all imagine that there's probably a lot of things that she could have done. But Pamela Hepburn was a boat captain, and she saw the role that she could participate in. She imagined that role through her identity. Then there was Paul Amico. He was an iron worker who saw iron work projects that needed to be done. "I'm not a middle of the river guy," he said. "That's the ferry captains. This strip here from the land to the edge of the water, that's my forte. So that's where I went." Tugboat operators often saw themselves as people who tackled trouble. And what they saw unfolding on 9/11 was certainly trouble. Some ferried people out of harm's way, others jumped ship, so to speak, grabbing their radios, organizing the lines, and directing boats shoreside. There was former firefighter and freelance mechanic Tim Ivory. He was chief engineer of the John J. Harvey, a retired fire department boat, purchased really as a recreational effort by a group of friends. Initially, the Harvey assisted with the evacuation, but quickly the fire department recognized another urgent need. Along with his fellow crew members, Ivory was able to improvise and rig the Harvey to help pump water at ground zero, where the fire suppression infrastructure had been destroyed. The boats themselves had identities. Take the Harvey again for an example. One of its crew recalled that another had always said, "Gotta have a little bit of hose. Go buy a boat that's burning, it'd be really embarrassing not to have a little bit of hose." It was an offhanded remark, but it speaks to the pride and the preparedness of these mariners. They were on a fireboat, after all, and they were invested in ensuring her reputation of years of fire service. We even heard of a bartender on Pier 63, walking the lines, handing out water, handing out chips, offering a comforting word. What do we think of when we think of a bartender? That someone who welcomes us in, gets us a drink, makes us feel comfortable, makes us feel at home. So even he imagined a role for himself based on his identity. He could see a need, and he found a role to play.
And their identities also led them to imagine what could be needed and what could be done in the environment that they were so accustomed to living and working in. So consider this quote from John Crevy, the owner and operator of Pier 63. And he said, "So we get back and we see these thousands of people walking north. There was a boat that every Tuesday, there's a jazz thing called CD 101, and the Horizon, a 600-passenger charter boat, was scheduled to be here at 2 o'clock. So the first thing I did was call them on the telephone, and we were talking, and they decided to come anyway. I talked to them about the possibility of being involved in a relief effort to get some of the people out, because I saw all these thousands of people, and there just didn't seem to be any other way off the island. So they agreed to come in and see if they could facilitate taking people off the island by boat. So that was just kind of unplanned, and so they pulled in and we started forming lines. A number of my friends all ended up here simply because there were people wandering around who didn't know where to go. And this has always been a sort of sanctuary for people. So they and myself started getting some stanchions and ropes so we could make orderly lines should we start getting people organized to go on the boats." Well, here's what a harbor pilot had to say. "I think the Coast Guard put out a call for boats to respond for evacuation purposes. I didn't hear it myself. I was told that's what they did. Whether they did or they didn't, I think everybody, all the maritime community, was running, moving in that direction anyway. Everybody we had made a conscious decision, and we said, there's something going on here that's way above and beyond normal procedures. We're sending everything we got up there."
And they weren't the only ones. Paul Amico described it this way. "Actually, on the morning of September 11th, I was about 5 miles west of the Hudson River, right near Giant Stadium. I saw the smoke coming from the World Trade Center. I immediately went back to my shop, which is only another mile and a half away, grabbed my marine radio, life jacket, and headed straight for the lower New Jersey city to hop on a ferry. I knew there was a fire. I knew we had to do an evacuation, meaning the ferry companies. I feel responsible for building the docks. Therefore, I was very responsible for getting people out of there safely. I knew at one point when I saw the intensity of the fire that there was a possibility that the ferry terminal at the World Trade Center might not open. It's our busiest terminal, moving around 20,000 passengers a day. I knew that I might need to communicate with ferry boats to bring boats elsewhere. That's why I grabbed my radio, so I was in constant contact with the ferries no matter where I was on shoreline. These mariners could imagine needs that others could not because they were who they were."
And so a part of the maritime life figures into the motivations for their participation in the boat evacuation. These mariners were also driven by their application of the obligation to rescue. Many of the mariners that we talked to emphasized the professional duty to assist those who are in distress, and they cited the long-standing traditional and legal obligation that is so well known even to non-mariners. And yet upon closer scrutiny, the obligation to rescue doesn't provide the full underpinning for what the maritime community did that day. Because here's the quote, according to US law, which says that a master or individual in charge of a vessel shall render assistance to any individual found at sea in danger of being lost, so far as the master or individual in charge can do so without serious danger to the master's or individual's vessel or individuals on board. Whether that same obligation exists to assist someone on land is much more ambiguous. Still, the boat operators stretched the boundaries of their sense of obligation beyond the water to encompass at least some of the shoreline. The boat operators were not technically obligated, but they used this professional value as part of the source of their motivation. And there's something else about the maritime life, that it's a very paradoxical lifestyle. It's a blend of high technology and folkloric best practices, hierarchies and regulations, extensive planning and training, but also improvisation and making do. Running a ship typically relies on rules, procedures, sequences of tasks, and checklists, and these are drilled into prospective mariners through years of training or through intensive on-the-job experiences. Aphorisms and age-old adages prompt the management of different functions, so that sailors learn, for instance, that you're never far from a good DR, that is, the dead or deduced reckoning of an estimate of a ship's future position based on projecting its current course and speed. This common saying serves as a reminder to keep careful track of a ship's position as a check on fallible navigation aids, which are never to be trusted. Customs, norms, and mutual expectations among mariners, propelled by literally hundreds of years of seafaring tradition, underlie every order, act, or transaction in the maritime world. But in spite of the emphasis on procedures, the extent to which rules can be grafted onto the unpredictable marine environment is often limited by either economic or practical circumstances. The Coast Guard regulates for safety, but it cannot regulate too much, or else it will begin to impinge on the competitiveness of U.S. ships, which is the same regulatory dilemma that's encountered in all hazardous industries. The international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, which are known informally as the rules of the road, guide the interactions between vessels, choreographing the collision avoidance dance between ships either on the open ocean or in a crowded harbor. Navigation officers memorize pages of rules for meeting head-on, crossing at an angle, overtaking, and operating in fog. The object of this dance is simple: don't collide. But the rules are really only a starting point for the adaptive process of a lot of ships negotiating with each other underway in a busy waterway. And often, the rules do not cover a given situation. But there is even a rule for that, traditionally known as the General Prudential Rule, and now it's codified as simply Rule 2B, an important rule. It requires that mariners deviate from the rules if necessary to avoid immediate danger.
So listen to these quotes to hear the frustration of just a few mariners when they encountered others with less familiarity with this prudent deviance. They couldn't think outside the box. Almost every city worker I came in contact with could not think outside the box. They had to talk to their boss. They had to talk to their boss's boss. They were all trapped by their department's regulations. Another mariner described it this way: I truly think that rules and procedures were the biggest hindrance of the whole thing. I mean, who doesn't like a fireman? Wonderful guys. And the policeman? But we walked up to a policeman and we needed stuff. And he goes, I'll check with my sergeant the next time he comes around. And like, for Christ's sakes, can't you think? You know, we need something done now. And you're gonna wait until your sergeant shows up again?
Seafarers' lives of contradiction may explain why the mariners who were involved in the boat evacuation on 9/11 slipped so easily into this situation in which there were so many ambiguous guidelines and ambiguous roles. It is their professional imperative both to manage risk as well as to take risk. They're compelled to trust certain people and technologies, even as they distrust them at the same time, in case they should fail. Now, how these conditions fed precisely into each mariner's thoughts on 9/11 is impossible to say, because mariners do not talk in terms of conflicts or contradictions. But the idea is apparent in their tone. They want to do the right thing, but they don't want to get in trouble for it. So this was part of their culture. As one person we spoke with said, dealing with Mother Nature, you always get a curveball thrown at you, so you get used to thinking on your feet, rather than just sitting here and plotting what we're going to do for the day. It seems reasonable that comfort with instability made it possible for these sailors to head toward Manhattan without a clear idea of what they were going to do, equipped only with their usual tools and technologies, and with their willingness to act spontaneously based on what they saw, even if it meant breaking the rules. In other words, they were living out Rule 2B.
We also heard how they went from haphazardly sending people in every direction to assigning boats to destination, to creating signage to reflect that. One person recalled how the first tower collapse actually broke the momentum. Everything stopped. Everybody stopped, you know? The pier was full of people. The scene was as dramatic as you can get. And you know, they saw it. They can hear it. And everyone turned around and they looked and they were aghast. People were crying. After the shock paused, they continued to the buses and the boats kept arriving with more evacuees. It looked like, you know, the retreat from Stalingrad. You know, there were women with babies, carriages, rabbis, guys whose Brooke Brothers suits were covered with dust, you know. And they wanted to know where the buses were taking them. New Jersey, I told them, it's not that big of a state. You're not far from anything here. We'll get you home. Someone will pick you up. We're taking you to the stadium. Call somebody and get picked up. But that system continued to evolve. Another person said, eventually, we got on the wall and we told everybody to line up. We said, you know, people going to Staten Island, you go here. You're going to New Jersey, you go here. So they were improvising signage. They were not only breaking the rules or bending the rules, they were developing an emergent system. But at the heart, there were certainly lots of examples of rule breaking and rule bending. Boat captains initially overloaded their vessels, but it wasn't long before they paused, took a breath, and started to get a little more cautious. Still exceeding capacity, yes, but with a knowledge of what their boats could actually handle and what they could do safely, and then taking extra safety precautions on top of that. They cut down fences to better allow people to embark on boats. One person we spoke with described an act of liberation that in any other circumstance we might describe as theft. We saw there were 2 golf carts in the dock, and they were tied up right in front of the police boat. So we went over and we talked to the captain of the police and we asked him to please turn around because we were about to liberate 2 golf carts. So we took those golf carts and we put them to good use. And of course, I live in Jersey, my friend lives in Jersey. We're not being city kids. We didn't know how to hot start these things. So we got one of the engineers who could get it going for us. And then we started bringing supplies up well into the rescue site for people. And it was great because the golf carts let you go from the north side of the World Trade Center area down to the south side, to the west side, and somewhat over to the east side. So we were able to get pretty far ranging with what we could bring in terms of supplies from the water operation for the people. Even the Coast Guard official we spoke with said that he had broken more rules that day than he had broken in his entire career. Now, that's likely an exaggeration, but we get the point. He recalled an incident when someone was upset that the tugs were fueling fire trucks without a permit. A permit? I said. Nah, it's authorized under the Coast Guard in relation to an emergency. I said, no, it's a hierarchy of laws doctrine. We can all do this. And he was like, all right. And he walked off. And the chief was like, what's this hierarchy of laws doctrine? And I go, I don't know. He made it up, but it worked. He described what we call as the Mike Wallace barometer. Mike Wallace, as I'm sure most of you know, was a well-known journalist who gave tough interviews to key leaders and people who were making the news. The Coast Guard imagined that if he were being interviewed by Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, would he be able to defend obstructing something or turning the other way and letting something happen? If he could justify his decision on 60 Minutes to Mike Wallace, he would be okay with it.
Now, the mariners we spoke with certainly took on risk. The usual margin of safety was adjusted in this event with respect to the capacity of vessels and with respect to navigation. For example, in some areas around the harbor, the dust and ash was so thick that visibility was reduced to zero, yet some operators chose to enter the breakwater at North Cove on radar alone. One ferry skipper who shuttled evacuees to New Jersey's Liberty Landing called the process a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Maneuvering to North Cove was a tense job. His boat was fiberglass, and he reminded us cement and fiberglass don't go good together. He could not see with the thick smoke and dust. A normal day of fog or rain would have been like Christmas compared to this, he said. Offshore, the shoreline's image on the radar screen looks a lot like the outline of a nautical chart. But close range distorts the perspective because the shoreline is increasingly under the radar antenna and not in front of it. The image becomes blurred as the shoreline gets confused with the electronic echoes of buildings. The radar picture up close is more like an impressionistic painting than it is like a clear and detailed photograph. There is an art to using radar and to interpreting the electronic landscape. And this skipper relied on that art to feel his way with radar into North Cove. He remembered thinking, radar, don't fail me now. In these instances, we saw the maritime community navigating the many contradictions of their professional lives. They knew what they wanted to do. They wanted to transport people, but they knew that doing so would require a lot of liberties and actions that they normally would not take. They knew they were pushing boundaries, making their own decisions about safety, making new organizational relationships, and acting independently from their superiors. And another mariner said to us, it's just activity where you're running on adrenaline, you know? You're not rationalizing everything, but you're moving. Sometimes, though, they were nervous, and they were hoping that they would not cause a worse problem. And then suddenly, at a certain point, they sort of caught their breath, rethinking what they were doing. And reflecting back on it, one boat captain said, it got to a point where it was like you started to bounce back to reality. Let's slow down. Let's not get stupid here. Let's not end up with a bigger situation that doesn't have to be.
So should people just go around breaking rules? Not ordinarily. But most of the time, as far as we could tell after conducting 100 interviews, here is the important takeaway. When the rule breaking occurred and it was successful in the response, it was not done so with disregard. Whether it was officials or civilian mariners, those effective in the decisions to break rules did so thoughtfully. They did so with an effort to maintain the spirit of the rules, and they did so, thirdly, in deliberation with others. Even the Coast Guard official I just referred to brought someone along who would not be dissuaded by hierarchy or rank, saying what he thought. I knew his personality, and I wanted that personality there. I didn't want to be getting into arguments, but I still knew him well enough that he would speak truth to power. I trusted his judgment. Someone else might be intimidated by rank. Someone else may not have called out something that did not make sense, but this person would. As he stated, it was a personality call. They helped each other learn how far those rules could actually be stretched or what new rules could be made. They did not rely on a single judgment, but followed through on that maritime injunction against trusting any single piece of information.
The rules were important, but only insofar as they were guidelines rather than scripts. As one person we spoke with said, a plan to me is a range of options. A plan isn't what I'm going to do. How I view planning is it's a realm of options, and I'm going to choose what works best for me in a particular time. I always thought plans should be different from what other people think. They should give you an option. So as we give this talk at the Mariners Museum, where so many generations of maritime technology are on display, it's important to take a moment to reflect on how technology is one of those paradoxes that mariners are accustomed to working with. We all know, for example, the fabulous accuracy of GPS, but we also know that every nautical chart tells us that we're not supposed to rely on any single aid to navigation, including GPS. There's a lot of emphasis now on technology also in disaster management. We see talk of robots and drones, but a lot of disaster management is just old-fashioned hard work. It's lifting boxes, it's carrying things, it's unloading a truck, it's talking on the telephone, it's making lists. So when we're talking about options, and the person we talked to, he said he wants plans to be options, low tech or lower tech can be an option at sea, and it can be an option in disaster. Cell phones didn't work so well on 9/11, but the VHF radios aboard ship did work. The retired fireboat John J. Harvey, staffed by its crew of aficionados who had a knack for maritime restoration, pumped water at capacities that were impossible for modern fireboats. The John J. Harvey was in service for the Fire Department of New York from 1931 to 1994. It has the capacity to pump 18,000 gallons of water a minute. And as a historic cornerstone of the maritime contribution to firefighting in the city over the 20th century, it drew the attention of a group of maritime enthusiasts who purchased the fireboat at an auction in 1999. The boat was in a state of great disrepair, and the group set about fixing her up, and eventually they turned their association into a not-for-profit organization. The Harvey owed its strength and its durability to its heritage as a prime piece of equipment from a different era, the era of wooden docks, the era of wooden warehouses filled with flammable cargoes. All gone now from Manhattan. But suddenly, once again, the Harvey had just what was needed, the old-fashioned ability to just pump a lot of water. Not without some improvising, though. They had to shove Coke bottles into the piping to direct the flow of water through her systems, but she was able to supply water into shoreside fire hoses, replacing the water mains into the ground zero area that had been destroyed when the Twin Towers collapsed. And as one mariner said, that was the thing that happened. People would come in and they'd lend their expertise, whatever it happened to be. Most of the time, they were just schlepping stuff around, but then all of a sudden somebody would have an idea, and if it sounded like it was decent, we'd go for it. So from this, we can deduce a general rule about disasters, that disasters refresh the importance of technologies, skills, and systems that are thought to be old, obsolete, insufficient, inefficient, or cumbersome. And just as people may have unexpected capacities in disaster, so too do their tools and their artifacts.
The story of the boat evacuation is, of course, a compelling one. We touched on a few of these points today, and we talk about many more lessons in our book about the value of communication and coordination over command and control, about the value of emergence and decentralization in responses, or the fact that people really just have more capacity than they think they do. But we would like to leave you with this reflection from Captain Patrick Harris, who responded on his boat the Ventura, that historic morning. We emerged out of the smoke. It was so heavy in there, you could barely see maybe a boat length away. I saw this V-shaped formation of about a half dozen or so tugboats charging up in this direction. And I remember at the time, it just reminded me of the old black and white footage you see of Pearl Harbor. And with the smoke going over the water, and with the boats in motion, and everything was really black and white. There was so much smoke, you really couldn't see that blue sky. It was actually very inspiring to see that. Knowing those guys were going in there, and that's where all the trouble was. Thank you very much.